transferred down here because the Massena plant was closed up, or they call it a phase-out. So now I'm down here, and pretty bad news.
Where do you go from here?
Back up to Massena, I guess. Hope for a recall there or something.
Not really shocked because I knew there was something coming. So, and I just feel bad for the people that got less years than I got. So I'll have enough time to retire when they close.
Where do you go from here?
That's a good question. I'll just take it one day at a time. Trust in the Lord, and I'm sure everything will be all right.
Well, now union leaders do not believe Winters or General Motors when they say this decision was just made yesterday. United Auto Workers Chief John Gear says General Motors made this decision a long time ago.
For some wide. And that particular location has done everything humanly possible to do that. And while we're working hand in hand and singing the same tune, they are behind closed doors figuring out how they're going to close that plant.
Now, Gear says if the union would have had warning, it would have done everything possible to help the plant stay in business.
Another person who was very upset by the General Motors announcement was Central New York Assemblyman Michael Bragman. He'd been working for 2 months on keeping Fisher Guide in operation without much cooperation, he says. Bragman says the company never got back to him. Say about all of this. The people speak. Your chance to voice on this issue that will affect all of us here in Central New York. Give us a call now at 446-9999 and let us know what you think about the General Motors closing of Fisher Guide. It's a toll-free call in the Syracuse calling area. Again, it's 446-9999. We will be playing back some of your comments later on in this special report, and then again during 9 News at 5:30.
And when we come back, we'll be taking a look at the impact of General Motors' announcement on the nation and the economy.
We'll go live to Washington to talk with an expert on the auto industry for Kiplinger's Washington newsletter. That's coming up next.
Affected by General Motors plant closing announcements today, some will be able to move to other plants, but most will be out of work. And if local GM workers are looking to stay in the same or similar field, well, they're going to have a tough time finding jobs here in Central New York. But if they want to retrain for a different kind of job, that may be a whole lot easier.
There are a lot of government retraining paid opportunities for people in certain industries.
Plants, as well as Fisher Guide, will be closing.
Right now, let's take a look at the cities and the number of people who will be losing their jobs. In Wilmington, Delaware, an assembly plant is closing, 3,500 auto workers. Kalamazoo, Michigan, another 3,100 people out of work. Euclid, Ohio, a parts plant is closing, 550 workers there.
In Ewing, New Jersey, a parts plant with 2,050 workers slated to close next year. Livonia, Michigan, 2,000 workers will be let go. And a small plant in Sioux City, Iowa will close. Its 200 workers will be offered relocation to Rochester. There are several plants, GM plants, to try and sell. If they don't sell, it is understood that those plants will close.
And our coverage of the announced closing of the General Motors Fisher Guide plant continues. When we come back, we'll go live to the plant and our Dan Cummings.
And still to come, your chance to have your voice heard. The people speak. Call now at this plant.
Our Dan Cummings is standing by outside that plant at this hour. And Dan, is anything going on out there at all? Have you met any workers along the way?
Well, I've talked to a lot of workers today, Rod, mostly on the phone, as I gathered a lot of information from people who really, in many cases, were too shocked, their word, to talk. They're trying to soak this all in. We're standing just off GM Circle, as it's been called for years, with the plant directly behind me. You got to wonder how long they might call it GM Circle after next fall. You know, one of the things I learned today, besides the 1,400 or so families that are going to be directly affected late next year, 300 or so of those families had been moved to the Syracuse area during the mid-'80s as Fisher Guide grew and expanded, and their plastic parts making operation allowed laid off workers from other GM parts plants to come here. Ironically enough, they too, of course, will be out of work in a short period of time. We can only imagine what's going through the minds right now of the second shift workers as they do their job, as they've done it for years inside that plant. But I talked to with a guy by the name of Jim. He is the president of Local 854 of the United Auto Workers Union. He has spoken with the entire second shift just before they went in, and he says he continues to get that shocked reaction from them. This wasn't a 100% surprise to anybody, but I don't think many thought that Fisher Guide here in Salina would make the final hit list. And Jim even compared it to a cancer. He says people right now have been told their jobs are gone. Many are refusing to believe it, and it has to soak in for at least a couple of days before that lump in the throat goes away, before that really sick feeling in the stomach that, frankly, only a few of us could possibly imagine settles into something nicer. And it's such a terrible, terrible time of year for this to happen. When 9 News at 5:30 comes on, of course, I'll show you directly what many of you may not realize, and that is the parts that come out of this plant. You've seen them in your vehicles if you've ever driven or been in a GM car, but it's the work that's put paychecks here for a long time, and those paychecks, quite shockingly tonight, will not be here come fourth quarter of next year. It's bitter cold out here tonight, and you know it's very cold in the homes of these GM families throughout central New York this evening. Rod and Carrie?
Dan, it was last December when the news first came down that GM was going to be closing 21 plants, and the people at Fisher Guide were pretty sure, as sure as you can be, that they would not be among them. Why did they have that secure feeling?
Well, I think in part because in the mid-'80s, they invested heavily in this plant. Some machines that all by themselves cost $1 million each. The plastic molded injection machines were brought in here. A little bit of high tech, not a lot, but enough that they figured we have one of the most state-of-the-art, high-tech, and they do in fact have the largest, one of the largest in the world plants of this type, doing this type of plastic molded injection parts making. So I think they felt that of any of the plants that might close, good old Fisher Guide and Salina, our jobs won't, because we're up to speed, we're modern. Union has worked well with management locally here over the years to make the training possible. GM obviously had something else in mind when they made their decision. We're told they made it in Detroit yesterday. And so it's sinking in real hard here tonight.
Well, Dan, I was out there for several hours earlier in the day, and the workers I spoke with said there was just a ray of hope, as they put it, that some of them will be offered transfers within the General Motors organization, and beyond that, perhaps some early retirements might be possible. Earlier today, when you talked with Jim Ciotti of the UAW, did he have anything at all to say about that situation?
No, he didn't, but you know something else I learned today that may not bode well for such transfer notions. There is a sister plant to this Salina plant, I'm told, in Adrian, Michigan, nearly identical, another Inland Fisher Guide plastic parts making plant that is more or less the twin sister of this one behind me. But I'm told that that plant is nearly at capacity. So it's hard to know tonight, until General Motors tells us more specifics, where those transfers would go and where those people would work. This is 1,400 jobs, and with General Motors into the massive downsizing that we have known for a year now it's in, hard to imagine where those transfers will come. It'd be great. They certainly have the right, and they've earned the right to have the transfers. Now we'll find out if there are really jobs to transfer to.
Okay, Dan Cummings will be getting back to you at 5:30 with a look at just what kind of work the people at Fisher Guide do. We'll see you in a little while.
Thank you, Dan. Well, coverage of the closing of GM's Fisher Guide plant continues through 9 News at 5:30.
And coming up next, your chance to be heard. When we come back, the people speak on what General Motors announced.
Some 18,000 General Motors workers will be affected today by today's announcement that many plants will be closing, but most will be out of work.
Now, it's very sad news, especially during a holiday season. But there are some analysts who actually believe what is very bad news for Central New York is good news for GM. Cheryl Nathans has been on the phone today with some industry analysts, and some people are asking, Cheryl, why is this happening to Fisher Guide when Chrysler's new process gear plant is doing the opposite? They're expanding, they're growing.
They're hiring, which is very, very important. They hired 90 workers last week. What's the explanation for this? Well, you have to look back in the 1980s. There was Chrysler, there was Ford. They were coming up with new designs. They were cutting costs. Now they're putting more people on the payroll. Not so with GM, quite obviously. You mentioned, Carrie, you said bad news for Central New York, good news for General Motors. Why? Because last year General Motors lost $7 billion. That's the worst financial report of any company ever in the United States. So GM now has a chance to perhaps recoup some of its losses, start over again. This company, this organization has to be restructured. That's what I keep on hearing. They didn't keep up with the times. And naturally, that's a problem. It happens with lots of companies. You know, this is a statistic that you will really understand. It takes 45 man-hours to build one GM car. In Japan, it takes 20. and Ford and Chrysler are about the 30-hour mark. So you can understand the difference. You build cars faster, you pay people differently, you keep people on staff. It doesn't happen, and you end up, unfortunately, with something like GM. And understand, none of the auto workers are happy about this. NPG, you know, they're scared, but let's hope they're doing okay.
No one is happy tonight.
Sure.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, joining us now by satellite from Washington is the associate editor of Kiplinger's Washington newsletter. His name is Marty Chase. He is the Kiplinger organization's auto industry analyst. Marty, good evening.
Good evening.
First of all, we want to ask you, we've had a charge today by the United Auto Workers Union. One of the local union officials says the reason for the problems at General Motors is mismanagement. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the reason was quite possibly mismanagement in the mid-'80s. General Motors was very slow to move under the former chairman Roger Smith in the mid to late '80s, while its competitors Ford and Chrysler did make many of the necessary downsizing and restructuring moves. So I think there's some validity to that if you look into the past. I think looking into the future, perhaps some of these moves that we're seeing now give an indication that GM is realizing that it has to take these painful but necessary steps.
They lost $7 billion last year, and they're close to $3 billion this year. Of course, that's an improvement. But will these cuts, do you think, be enough to save General Motors?
Oh, yeah, I think there's no doubt that General Motors will survive. I mean, you have to remember that General Motors has many, many strengths. The losses, the $7 billion in losses was in its North American auto operations last year. They have roughly cut that in half this year. They still have a long, long way to go. And I think also you have to put it into the context of there's virtually no automaker anywhere in the world that's making money right now. We have pretty much a worldwide slump. I mean, Chrysler, I guess, did eke out a profit last quarter, but generally it's been tough times worldwide for the auto industry.
Marty, as you may or may not know, we're losing more than 1,300 jobs here in central New York with the closing of GM's Inland Fisher Guide plant. Do you think there's any possibility some of these jobs we're losing will wind up south of the border?
Well, I don't know specifically about your jobs there. I think that the longer term, there's no question that with the prospect of a North American free trade agreement, free trade with Mexico next year, that we will see a continuing flow of jobs in the auto parts and components industry move across the border to Mexico. I think maybe the big factor in terms of the parts plants may have more to do with the purchasing revolution that's underway at GM. You know, about 70% of GM's parts and components traditionally have been produced in-house. Under the new director of purchasing there, that's changing. They're outsourcing. They're moving that out of the company. So I think perhaps on some of these closures that were announced today, that may perhaps be a bigger factor than the Mexico angle.
All right.